Welcome to the Critical Therapy Antidote Podcast.
Dr. Susie Bennett, welcome to the CTA Podcast. It's so nice to see you.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Thank you for joining me. Susie, you are a researcher in specifically in the area of male suicide at the University of Glasgow.
That's correct, yes.
And you are currently funded by an organization called MANA, which I'd like to know a lot more about. But just to get started for our audience, and I'll return back to that for sure. But for our audience, for the people who maybe aren't familiar with your work, what inspired you to focus your research and your work on male suicide? How did you find yourself in this space?
So I was doing my master's back in 2018 and picking a dissertation topic to study. So I was doing a master's in social and cultural psychology, and I'd really fallen in love with studying. It was such a gift to be in an older age, going back to learning and education. I really wanted to find a question for my dissertation that kind of sat in my soul, like something that resonated in the core, something that I wanted to understand as a human being, something that was pertinent to my kind of journey and story. Challenges to do with suicidal thoughts and feelings have been a part of my family's story for many of the years leading up to me doing my master's. In 2018, this was the time of the sort of Me Too movement had sort of re-exploded, re-emerged, and there was this big conversation in the UK, at least, around this idea of men being all powerful, all privilege. That conversation was rooted in a lot of pain and trauma for people. I understand kind of the emotions behind it, but at the same time, there was a feeling that we were losing perspective in terms of the reality of men's lives, because there was also this statistic in the UK, at least, that suicide was, and it's still the same, that suicide is the biggest killer of men under 50. And 3/4 of all suicide deaths in the UK are male. So there were these two sort of opposing ideas that were kind of emerging around this sort of narrative about men having all the power, all the privilege, and yet men at the same time dying at the highest rate of deaths of despair. And I thought there's something absolutely vital in the middle that's like shrouded in invisibility, at least to me at that time, and it seemed to other people around me in terms of how I felt the conversation was being held publicly. And so I really wanted to understand what was going on for men. And I suppose I entered this work, Michael. I grew up with three brothers, four of us 4 years apart. I grew up very immersed in masculine energy, very, very close to my brothers. I love them. I'm lucky that they're dear friends as well as my brothers, and their love has been absolutely instrumental to me in my life. So I entered the work kind of in the spirit of someone who felt they had a very open heart and strong bonds with men. And now here we are in 2025, 7 years later of doing this work. And I have had so many things transformed for me. And at times, Michael, it's been very emotional for me to realize that I really didn't understand men as I thought that or hoped that I did at the beginning of this work. And so it's been a tremendous kind of personal learning curve, as well as I hope the research we produce is useful for other people too.
And really coming from this place of having this immersive love for your brothers, for the men in your life, and noticing this what sounds like, the last couple of years, there has been a bit of a black and white divisive narrative as it pertains to men. You were saying it around 2018 Me Too era, on the tail ends of that, just this commentary that said men had all the power, and yet you're seeing this discrepancy. 3/4 of the men in the UK, it was 3/4 of men of deaths by suicide
a male.
Are male. And that's such a huge, such a disparity just on its face. And it's hard to reconcile that narrative with the fundamental reality of how, assuming that power is all good and power is in some way beneficial to the individual, if they did have all the power, it doesn't seem like it's doing anything to buffer out anything related to suicide, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, as you start to talk to men and listen to their stories, you realize that in terms of the men I work with, which is men who are suicidal, and I'm sure men you work with clinically as well, these are men who experience such a lack of power in so many ways through their life, and a lack of privilege, and a sort of, in some ways, often any person in pain, it's such a medicinal thing, Michael. I'm sure you experience this in your work all the time, to have that pain seen, just seen by somebody, heard, recognized. It just, of course it doesn't cure everything, but it just starts to diffuse the kind of iron grip of that pain inside a person. And in many ways, I think men have the opposite of privilege in terms of having their pain seen. I think that there's a real challenge in our societies and cultures for us to understand men in their own terms as human beings that have had experiences where they've been deeply harmed, by life.
I think you said the key word there for me, which is human being, and something along the lines of, and I've noticed this amongst, I've spoken about it before, but even amongst clinicians, sometimes a difficulty in approaching, I think there's an intellectual understanding that you're talking to a human being, but there's often this disjuncture, this mismatch between an expectation that men have emotions, but a kind of a strange, almost batting at them to express their emotions, which is pushing somebody to go into emotional expression is almost antithetical to the position that they have emotions, because there's something very jarring about the experience of being pushed or prodded or criticized into that position. And I think you brought up the a major misperception here about how we're approaching these situations, that men too can benefit from a cool cloth being applied when they are in distress, and that they really can be benefited from being seen and witnessed in this way.
Absolutely. And to be understood in and I know that you all know this clinically as well, but so often that pain is so deeply historical in terms of someone's life. So, and particularly men, I think, when we think about things like childhood adversities, childhood challenges, I talk about this potential double jeopardy that boys who experience challenges in childhood may be vulnerable to, in terms of experiencing pain in childhood and then being socialized in these masculine ideals to suppress your pain, deny it, be independent, be self-reliant. Where does that pain ever find meaningful release? So often, I think, for men who are suicidal, they've been so isolated with these difficult things, and you have to then develop your own coping strategies and sometimes that might be to minimize it, because that makes it bearable, to say, it wasn't that bad. And that, of course, then can be adaptive in some circumstances, but over the long term, it can be also lead to its own sort of problems and challenges.
A white knuckling approach.
Yes, absolutely. I remember having a beautiful conversation with a man who was saying to me that the suppression was the only way, in a sense that it was the only option given to him in terms of how to deal with the things that happened to him. And so the suppression became the way of coping. It became his kind of almost sort of mantra and focus, and all his energy kind of went into, the more he could suppress, the more he felt he was able to try and stay afloat. And at the same time also, Michael, I was speaking to men who, it's almost like they know they have this sort of tidal wave of trauma hanging over their head, but there are so many demands in their day-to-day life that they're like, if I stop and enter a therapeutic process and that tidal wave comes crashing down, I don't have the luxury of drowning for a period of time. Like, the demands of my life are such that I need to keep going. And I also, have real respect for that level of self-awareness, almost, to know what your capabilities are at a certain period. Yeah,
But almost a sense that if I let my guard down for a moment, the dam's going to break, and I will be absolutely flooded by the experience, and I won't be able to function and keep up with my responsibilities and what I know.
Exactly, because so much has accumulated that hasn't been processed. And that's what an invisible backpack of burden to be carrying through life. So then when society turns around and says, you have all the power, you have all the privilege, and nobody sees this invisible backpack that's absolutely teeming with difficult, complicated things, it can feel so brutal.
in particular when life doesn't stop adding to the backpack. If, those things that
Yeah.
remain unaddressed, unfortunately, can accumulate over time. And it seems that, we're talking about things like suicide. We're talking about somebody who, male or female, has been carrying something with them for some time. You mentioned before that there was so much you didn't really understand about men prior to doing your research, and I was so curious if there was something specific. What has surprised you in your work so far? What is it about the story of men that's changed for you?
I think that, when you stopped me earlier and you said the important word that you've said there is human being, like I feel, as I'm saying these words, Michael, I feel some shame inside of me to be saying these publicly, because you think, how could I have ever allowed myself to get to a point where this wasn't the case? But I think this work has really, really, really rooted me so deeply in the humanity of men. And I think that I have had my life changed by the conversations that I've had with men. I say this often when I talk about this situation. There's a real reality to this problem of male cultural norms of male emotional suppression, and how that can leave so many men isolated with these backpacks that are accruing kind of distress in them that they don't feel able to share with other people. So there is an issue in terms of men's emotions that can come as a consequence of that. But at the same time as well, richness of emotional dialogue and insight and connection that I have in conversations with men who are suicidal. Like, these are people that have such a kind of, and I don't want to in any way diminish the absolute horrendous pain of feeling like you are struggling to stay in existence. I've had moments of feeling that myself, and it is absolutely horrendous when it comes. So I don't want to in any way diminish kind of the brutality of that, but the incredible kind of emotional wisdom that men who are suicidal have given me. And I always say as well that they anchor my life the whole time in the direction of things that give existence meaning, because the things that men who are suicidal are craving, the things that they're in pain for, the needs that they have that are not being met, are the things that make life valuable and precious. And so, I don't talk to men who are suicidal who say to me, I wish I had this bigger car, or that I've got this apartment or this promotion or any sort of material things. It's this aching and craving for like belonging, acceptance, purpose, connection, love, all of those things that remind you all of the time, that's what matters. That's where I want to sort of be putting my time and attention in my sort of personal life as well. But so I think through doing this work, really understanding men as these incredibly beautiful emotional beings from whom I learn many, many things, and men with deep, deep, deep relational needs, deep needs to have purpose in their relationships, to feel wanted, to feel desired, to feel that they matter, to feel that they're contributing, to feel that they have access to the people that they care about. All of those things, mean that when I meet a man now, I totally different. And I don't mean in work, I mean just, socially, different things that I'm curious about now, about his reality, and different sensitivities to the things that he may be struggling with, or that, craving. So it's brought a lot of riches. And Michael, the other thing to say is that I've met so many glorious men through doing this work, not just through the research, but also in terms of men who created interventions. Particularly in the UK, we have this amazing, beautiful movement of peer-led community interventions emerging, ordinary men who were just wanting to do something about what's happening, and creating these spaces of connection and care for men, men in the therapeutic professions, which I know it's not always easy to be a man in those environments, and, men doing incredible work therapeutically with people of all genders, but, for men as well. So, yeah, it's been it's a real privilege in so many ways. And also, of course, Michael, heartbreaking. Like, I'm sure you see this in your work as well. Like, it is distressing to see how our societies and cultures can allow people to accumulate so much pain in their backpacks.
Yes, and it often, I kind of look at it as those moments where you hear those heartbreaking, those existentials, those ineffable qualities to life, the difficult to describe because they're so situational and they're so personal. I
Yeah.
often, I often look at the pain that speaks to that need as kind of this prelude to something brighter. And it seems like what you're describing is in your work, having talked to so many men in distress who were suffering or have suffered, that you were able to kind of identify what it is that's really, really in their heart that really would actually sate them on a human level. And I can't say human enough, I think, in this conversation, because, on the one hand, you were describing before the rhetoric that was starting to pop up around Me Too, and also the impact of narratives that men might internalize in terms of what they should be doing with their feelings or how they should be handling their feelings, whether they should keep them to themselves. But I think, something that occurred to me is that when you have that in combination, when you have a sense that something along the lines of like, you can't really actually speak to those feelings because you're in a position that precludes you from having them. There seems to be something that's gone on in our culture, at least over the last couple of years, that has exacerbated a tendency to have an apathy towards the male experience. And I wonder if that's a sense you've had as well, and where you feel like that might stem from.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really summed up in the UK best by the resistance around the idea of creating a minister for men politically in the UK. So the idea kind of got mooted last year, and there was a tremendous amount of kind of backlash against it, because I think that the position is that as we discussed earlier, this position of men have all the power and the privilege, and that maybe, I hear people kind of say, well, maybe the patriarchy hurts men too, and therefore men might deserve a bit of consideration. But it's almost like, but you created the patriarchy and now it's hurting you. So your compassion for you is diluted in a way that for other demographics of people, it can be, more whole. And I think that there's so many markers in our societies that demonstrate men are in real need. So, for example, and I know that George the Tin Men is brilliant at like speaking to this in terms of like homeless populations, substance abuse, men in prison, the suicide rate, boys in education. There's so many ways in which there's data that shows us men are in trouble. And so the fact then that we can't, that there's this barrier towards accepting that, which I think is this kind of compassion barrier, which of course is so essential in my work, Michael, because somebody in suicidal pain, as we discussed earlier, is in such urgent need of compassion. And so I don't think that we'll move anywhere meaningfully in terms of the male suicide issue until that compassion wall is, taken down.
Because that is cross-cultural, isn't it? There does seem to be, generally speaking, an understanding cross-culturally that there is an issue for men, particularly as it relates to suicide. But there's this idea of an empathy gap in clinical literature, and that there are a number of things that kind of foster this empathy gap. It's exactly what it sounds like. It can be anything related to political affiliation, ranging from political affiliation to gender to sexual orientation. But it seems that one of the major empathy gaps seems to be around gender in particular. I guess the point I was trying to get to earlier is, yes, maybe men are being socialized at times not to express themselves, but are we being socialized to not feel and receive their pain?
I think it's also about the stories that you hear. So if the prevailing narrative that you hear is that men have all, or a lot of the power, a lot of the privilege, and then to the work that I do, Michael, I'm hearing stories from men all of the time about abuse that they've experienced, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse in childhood or in their relationships now, horrific bullying, body issue challenges, money problems, employment problems, crushing self-esteem, parental alienation. The list goes on and on. All these different things. I can't look at men through the lens of power and privilege anymore, because I'm meeting all the time them in the sort of fullness of their humanity as people that have had very complicated lives where harmful things have kind of happened to them. And I can't stress enough what I believe is a deep, deep violence to not be met. Any persecuted group of people is going to tell you the violence that comes from the assumptions that are made about who I am based on some marker of my identity that I can't control, that are these social and cultural ideas that then get, projected onto me. We humans need belonging and connection and acceptance and intimacy. And I think that the violence that comes when we build a wall around a group of people and make assumptions about what their emotional reality is and their experiences are is, really, really dangerous. I'm not saying it's never warranted in life. I do think, but I really, really think once you start dialing in to how the conversation about men is held in our societies and cultures, I can't escape the undertone of violence, emotional, psychological violence that I hear in some of the ways that men are talked about. I understand, Michael, for a lot of people, it comes from a deep place of trauma. And so I don't in any way wish to diminish that. But at the same time, there is trauma on all sides in this, conversation. And we're never going to move productively forward until we start kind of deep listening to one another. And I think that there's a concern for me sometimes that socially we're only comfortable talking about men and boys when it's through the lens of them doing harm. So, for example, the explosion that's come, I don't know what it's been like in America, but in the UK, after adolescents got screened, suddenly everybody wanted to say something about boys when it was through the lens often of them as potential
perpetrators.
Yeah, exactly. We're not giving that same energy to the conversation about all the ways in which so many boys and men are being harmed by life. When I look at my research and my work, I see so many men who are suicidal going through such difficult, complicated things in childhood when they're being exposed to real harm. And society has not taken care of them or supported them or protected them. And that's a vitally important conversation that we need to be having.
Mm-hmm. It almost, I've often noticed this for the last couple of years, and this is kind of the term that's bubbled up as a result that I use, which is when we start to talk about a group that potentially does, if you talk about oppressor-oppressee dynamics, you talk about the oppressed as being the marginalized category of people. When you start to generate a narrative like that, you create an outgroup that can be re-marginalized as a result. And it seems to me that the dialogue around men being those in power, coming back to that kind of idea, is a remarginalization of the majority of men who are just human beings living their lives.
Yeah.
And that we've conflated this small subset of men with the whole, the small group of men who are either extremely successful on the one end or who engage in behaviors that are maybe less
abhorrent. Yeah.
Right. Or even just from a moral lens, less than what we might want in terms of our social norms, however we might conceptualize that. And we've really pushed the bulk of men towards the fringes as the margin, as the marginalized, if you will. I mean, the things you're describing, you're talking about, parental alienation, isolation, neglect. In some cases, I would imagine, from clients I've worked, actual physical violence in some cases in the household. How could somebody not start to have difficulties in their lives under those circumstances? I don't think it's a question of how could you, it's how can you not? There was a time where we used to have more of a reflexive flip to the questions that we'd taken for granted. And it's less of a question for me of how do they get to that point, of how are the ones who aren't getting to that point, not getting to that point.
Yeah. Yeah. How are you surviving? And the incredible resourcefulness that can come from how you learn to cope in those kind of scenarios, starved of many of the nutrients that, we know to be positive to growth and development. But I think, it's really interesting what you're saying. And I wonder how much the things that I'm talking about play out for you, you see in
in a clinical setting.
And in the profession.
I would say over the last couple of years, there's definitely been a change. And I think I saw it around me too as well. I got in the field in 2017, prior to going back for any higher level degree. And I certainly started to notice the trickling in of commentary that I couldn't contextualize it all. Not from every colleague, not from the majority of colleagues. So I would never pin this on mental health professionals at large. But, every so often I would have a colleague say something and I'd say, hey, if we said that same thing, the word privilege is starting to get thrown around. And this was probably one of my earlier, not to turn the scope on me, but kind of my earlier understandings that something had shifted, but I couldn't quite capture it yet. It wasn't until years later that I realized there were these undertones that we could kind of pin back to certain rhetoric that had gotten popular that was being transformed into something that looked like action, not just words. It's very easy as a clinician to lose your empathy if you allow rhetoric to motivate and fuel your activities on a one-on-one basis or even a group dynamic. It's very easy to let the outside world get into that private space that you call your therapy room. And I don't think that clinicians necessarily talk about this as much as they really should, because if we were more honest about this with each other and could feel less shame around it with each other, which ideally would be part of our training, we could probably manage these things. But at the same time, we'd have to have the attitude that these things need to be managed more effectively. And that's been kind of what's been missing over the last couple of years for us. Given that we're talking about one gender, I feel like it's impossible not to, talk about the other. In terms of suicide, do you see in your work an indication that men and women handle things related to suicide differently? Are there different risk factors? Are there different protective factors that you see between the genders that you've noticed? And
yeah, it's a great question. I don't research suicide in women, so I can't speak to that from a research perspective, but I think of suicide. I don't know if you play an instrument, but I play the piano, and I think of it like a chord of pain with 3 notes in it. And I think those 3 notes are the chord of pain in anybody's like symphony of suicide, because we human beings with the same needs, and when those needs aren't being met, we feel pain in response to that. And I think that those 3 notes pertain to your relationship with your emotions. So your ability to cope with, we're feeling beings. I've got feelings coming into my system all of the time, feelings held in memory that, just feelings happening.
it's a good sign.
And
Yeah.
that you're alive. And
Yes.
that we need to have a functioning relationship with those feelings, because almost every theory of suicide will tell you that one of the primary drivers of it is overwhelming pain that the individual doesn't know how to deal with or cope with in that moment. And often that pain is rooted in historical things, structural things, society, culture. But in that moment of suicidal crisis is an overwhelm of, so your ability to manage your relationships absolutely critical. And if that gets out of kilter, then that is a note of pain in your chord. The other note is how you think and feel about yourself. And the third note is about your like intimate connections with other people, your feelings of belonging, acceptance, reciprocal bonds of love. I think those 3 notes are in most people's chord of suicidal pain. I think when you start to look at how men are socialized to have relationships with those 3 notes, those 3 psychological domains, we can start to see maybe there are additional risk factors here for men. Cultural norms of male emotional suppression, cultural norms of male success, and what that does to men in terms of their feelings of failure or their feelings that they need to be self-reliant to cope alone. And then men's like intimate connections with other people. If I'm being told, suppress your pain, don't share your vulnerability, be independent, stay in control, all of those ideas narrow the space in which I can build, meaningful connections with other people. And so I think, and then you can take different demographics of people. If we took queer people, for example, and how homophobia then maybe affects that note of feelings towards self, or how it affects relationships with family or whatever. There's different demographics that I think you can take and look at how those chords are that chord is resonating in
That chord's even struck.
in their life. So, but I think that for men, there are real sort of cultural harms happening for them, which Michael, once you start dialing into the human reality of the human cost of those norms, like you cannot be the same. I remember speaking to this wonderful older man who'd made an attempt on his life. And he'd said to me that at the time of making his attempt, his thought process was that it was better for him to die than to tell his wife he was struggling. Like that, if that doesn't bring you, like, metaphorically to your knees and make you want to weep for the ideas that we're instilling in other human beings, I don't know what's wrong with you. Because for me, that is, that is the brutality that somebody can be led to hold those sorts of belief. I remember speaking to another man whose family member, a male family member, had died by suicide. And on the day he died, he texted the man I was talking to say that he loved him. And he said that was the first time he'd ever said that to me. And in him saying that to me, I immediately knew something was wrong. Again, Michael, that is, I cannot think of a more violent manifestation of the harm that these cultural ideas can cause to somebody, that the first time you as a human being feel able to tell someone you love that you love them is on the day that you're ending your existence, I think is absolutely so distressing. And that's why, Michael, sometimes it's hard for me to stay calm, when I'm talking about whether we need a minister for men or talking about the empathy gap. It's hard when you're positioned where I am, and probably the same for you as well. When you're hearing those stories, you're seeing the human reality of the sort of difficult conditions that so many men are living under. It's hard to tolerate the sort of casual dismissal, I think, that sometimes can pervade the conversation around men's pain and men's experiences.
It can be hard to process all that and digest that. In particular in a society when, if you're trying to tell the society, hey, this is going on, and they all recognize it's going on, but then you say, and here are some things we can do, and then they all kind of, it feels like they're turning away. It's a lot to hold and a lot to carry.
Yeah.
Something you pointed out just in that example alone was, it wasn't just that, for me, it wasn't just that he learned to say I love you near the end when he was about to make a choice about his own mortality, but it was the fact that his friend noted the difference, that it was such a stark difference for that individual.
Yeah.
In proclaiming that he could, love, or that he did love in that relationship, that he was able to pick up on that change.
Yeah.
And something's not quite right. And it kind of brings me to this question of, do you think we understand the language of men?
No.
I think we often throw the term alexithymia, the inability to feel one's emotions, out at men. I've even heard it called male pattern alexithymia or male typical, something along those lines. And I've found that kind of to be a curious way to describe it, because I think that actually is almost a projection in some sense, in some cases, where it's like, do we understand the language that maybe they are using a language that we're not picking up on? Maybe there is something more typical to the male or masculine experience that we're not noticing. And I know that in your work, you've interviewed men who are in this state or have been in this state. Have there been like things that have kind of resonated with you in terms of how they describe their experience? Things that can maybe clue people into what to pay attention to?
I find that, for example, the sort of language of mental health or mental illness can be alienating for a lot of men. A lot of times when I'm speaking to men, they don't use that language to talk about what's happening for them. Some men really, really find it beneficial, but almost every single man that I've ever spoken to has spoken to me about their pain, his pain. I think this language of pain, the idea of pain, can be very helpful. Something else popped into my head and then completely fell out. I was saying, just to come back to your point about the not having language for your emotions, I think that it's definitely a theme in some aspects of my research of men feeling like they don't know how to describe what's going on for them. And I think then that there is a fear, how would I utilize therapy, for example, which in their minds is completely incumbent on being able to describe what
their emotional experience.
Yeah. But in my experience, I've never met a man who hasn't been able to really, when given a time and space that they feel is compassionately pure, if that there's not another agenda or whatever, that actually there's amazing reservoirs of emotional insight in there. But I think the thing about the challenge often in talking about this stuff it's as if I'm trying to say that men are some uniform thing, was actually men are unbelievably diverse, and like one man's language is completely alienating and awful to another man. So I think kind of dialing into the different ways in which men want to describe their realities to you is really, really important, and not privileging one way as being
better or
more.
worse necessarily.
Yeah, yes, exactly. It's somebody's individual sense making about, their experience. But I also believe, Michael, that like I know for myself as someone who's benefited greatly from therapy, like the more therapy I've had, the more fluent I've become in the things that have happened to me, in the language of Susie. And so I'm better able then to communicate to other people the bits that I want to share with them. I always say with therapy, in fact, it was a young guy said this to me once. I thought it was so beautiful the way he put it. Had a very difficult life, very sweet boy. And he said that through his therapy, had the experience of his therapist listening to him helped him listen better to himself, and had like basically facilitated him to have better conversations with himself. And I think that's the kind of magic of therapy in a way. It's not necessarily that that you leave therapy and start telling your problems to everybody. It's about developing that understanding for yourself about what's going on for you. And I think for a lot of men, feeling like they have as much sort of agency and control over their lives is, for some men, a really important thing. And I think helping understand how therapy can support you to do that, like the better, like I say, emotional understanding that I've had about the things that have happened to me and how they shape me in my behavior, has given me way more control and agency over my life and my choices and decisions. I've got way off tangent on what you were.
No, not at all. I mean, you have popping up for me, as I often describe the process of therapy for me is not just so that I can understand a client, but so they can understand themselves. And if I'm oriented with that, if I'm aligned with that goal in the therapeutic process, that they can understand themselves too, then something very interesting happens. I don't step on my own feet as much, which can happen in therapy. I don't step on my feet as much and try and prescribe my goals, because it's not about my goals in that frame. It's not about my goals in that space. I may, under certain circumstances, need to take a more direct approach with certain people. But generally speaking, the beauty and the gift of therapy is that we all have we have a common language, and then we have our own personal language. And then we also have our own personal language internally of how we map out our experience. And being able to transcribe that and to translate it to another person can be unbelievably transformative, but not the least of which, as part of that transformation process, what you mentioned is being able to translate it for yourself in a workable way that allows you to apply it to your life. It's such a beautiful thing to see someone have that moment. Maybe the language is different to me. I was trained in it, and had a great mentor who always would push me if a client said they were sad to investigate what they meant, never taking any word for granted. This might sound simple, but it's actually quite hard, because in the process of conversation, it's very easy to skate over what you think sad is. When somebody's explaining to you they're sad, sometimes you get an answer that just is completely out of left field from the common consensus of what sadness is. And that can be actually a really fascinating and beautiful and revealing conversation. So I think that's what really came up for me there. Now, there was something that I was curious about. I think one of the conversations that's been coming up culturally is about fathers in the household. We're seeing a statistical either prevalence or rise related to fatherlessness in the household. And I'm wondering if that, in your view, plays into this at all in terms of male suicide. Are there any correlations to an absence of a father in relationship to these experiences for men?
I would love to do a big piece of research looking at this question that you're asking, and the different dimensions of fatherhood in terms of how it plays out in terms of suicide risk. I think both fathers that stay have a lot of mental health needs that aren't always being supported and looked at, and fathers that lose access to their children, there's definite, of course, profound risks there. And then fathers who are absent from more, different reasons, and there's additional risks there for the child as well. So I think that the work that I've looked at in terms of this question has been more about how childhood experiences have impacted men who are suicidal, which from a qualitative work like an absent caregiver, has been one of the
factors.
issues mentioned. And I think, when we think again about that sort of core to suicidal pain, how the absence of a caregiver, of course, it depends on the context and circumstances of the absence. But, in a situation where they've left, what that then does, for example, the note in relation to your thoughts and feelings of self, like what then gets internalized about you as a human being. How does it impact then that other note in terms of meaningful connections to other people? How do you, feel trust and safety with other people when you've had this experience of someone leaving? Now, of course, I've spoken to dads who fucking desperate to see their kids and are in brutal legal systems and procedures, and so there's all kinds of stuff going on at this issue. But I think that there can be a risk at two levels, both for the father and both for the child as well. Of course, depending on the circumstances, it could be
having this risk factor at a father who has his own mental health needs not being met, and even though he wants to be present for his family, potentially not being able to meet those demands, but also for a son, a burgeoning man, guy, who will eventually be in those shoes, either having the absence or potentially having the modeling in front of them that does not set them up for success. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, but yeah, absolutely. I think as well that there's a kind of, lots of amazing men being fathers, but there's not really a conversation so much about, the mental health struggles for dads, what it means to suddenly have that responsibility and the fears and anxieties. And particularly if you're a father that didn't have a good father role model yourself, where do you, so I think that there's lots of ways in which we need to be better supporting fathers and families in general. It's such a critical age, Michael. I mean, you see that right in your work all of the time, I'm sure, the legacy and impact of childhood experiences for people.
Certainly. And in particular, you mentioned the legal system, which I've definitely worked with clients, men who are, for whatever reason, having a difficult time and either gaining access to their kids, or in some cases, even being seemingly the more suitable parent under the circumstances, but still getting dragged through the court system, unfortunately. And I'm talking for years and years, not a couple months, not a couple weeks, like a long time, and really battling that out, showing how much they really do love and invest in their kid. And those stories can absolutely break your heart in 7 different ways at the same time. And but the conventional wisdom typically and understandably for the early childhood years for children has been to have more of a slant towards motherhood and a mother having access to her children. Again, understandable from like a developmental and a biological lens, let's say, but from an emotional lens, not always the most suitable parents. And I don't know that we're actually having that conversation of who really is the more suitable parent in those circumstances in particular. It almost is like, it's almost as though it can feel like the court system is trying to drag it out when to the point that the mother is the suitable parent or something along those lines, which if there's a way to get resources for that individual to where they can actually, fulfill that role, I think it's perfectly reasonable to try. But at the detriment of the child who's kind of being pulled along in that wake, it's to no one's benefit in the situation.
Yeah.
I feel like we can't get away from the conversation of men and male narratives without bringing up a term that's become unbelievably popular. I think you already know where I'm going to go, but I'm just going to say it anyway. Toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
Became it got its tour dates and it stuck to them. It got around, and it absolutely has had one hell of a performance. But what kind of effect have you seen this term have on men, if any, and what do you think of it professionally?
I mean, I kind of just want to dig it a grave and bury it and be, but I understand it's out there, and I think like I say, Michael, where I'm positioned, I see so much of the violence that comes as a consequence of not just because of this, but because, how certain cultural ideas that we have about men and masculinity, like the manifestation of violence and pain and suffering that can come as a consequence of that. And from the position that I take up, I cannot see any value in a phrase like toxic masculinity. And I really, really particularly worry for young boys. Like I'm a queer person, and I grew up in the 90s and 90s when people did not say nice things about gay people. And even now at 43 years old, I still find seeds in my forest of self rooted in that internalized homophobia that I was exposed to from a young age, telling me that there was something shameful and awful inherent to who I am. And I think about these phrases like toxic masculinity, and I think it's different, but it's similar cultural toxins that I think the danger is young boys are breathing in, and the danger for all people of all genders, that we learn to fear men, that we learn to assume that these are people capable of very dangerous and harmful things. And I know for people that is their kind of reality, but there's these huge swathes of men that are being crushed, I think, underneath this label that is in no way reflective of how they conduct their lives and who they want to be in the world. We have to give young boys a vision of masculinity to aspire to. Any minority group will tell you the importance of positive representation. We talk about it so much in the queer community. We need queer stories. We need positive role models. We need things to aspire to get our fucking self-esteem off its knees and back into a, shoulders back, head up kind of way. It's the same for, for men as well. Like the world is on fire in so many ways. I want us to be giving men a vision of masculinity, of how it's going to contribute, as we all need to, in terms of like creating a gentler vision for us all. So for me, I think I'm kind of I think there's a reality. There are I think toxic ideas of men and masculinity. Like for me, it's a toxic idea to say to somebody, you should always suppress your pain. I'm not saying that there aren't circumstances and conditions when that's probably the sensible thing to do. So it's not that in every scenario that's the truth. But I think that the danger with a phrase like toxic masculinity is it implies that there's something inside of you, Michael. By virtue of being a man, there's something inherent about you that has the possibility to be toxic. But that's true of every human being.
Hey, don't put it on me now.
But I tell you, as a woman, I have absolute potential to do harm and to be bad human being. I think that the other sort of consequence for me, in a way, of the kind of conversation that we're having about the genders is that we somehow assume that women are kind of this, emotionally regulated, morally pure entity. But no, I mean, life has happened to me, and that as a consequence means that I can do behaviors that are not aspirational. And I think that
it's almost a fairer sex paradigm that is long-handed,
yes,
long-standing at this point, where, although we're not speaking about women in that way, perhaps we're acting in alignment with the supposition that women fall into this pure, emotionally regulated, compassionate category, where I know just in my personal life and in my clinical role, that I've worked with men and women who can exhibit very similar, if not the same behaviors across the board. But then when we kind of scale up to this more general sociological way of looking at a group, it becomes, and the findings we have get negotiated culturally as being examples of the presuppositions you held in advance. Then we're really in a mess, because you said it earlier, each of the men you speak to, it's hard to speak about men proper as though it's just a subject.
yeah.
When we're talking about, you're interviewing individuals that have individual meaning making involved in their personal experiences, and that are researched, in my view, is to come up with categories that we can correlate and ascribe to certain experiences, but the devil's always in the details. If you really want to understand the pain that you can, let's say, create a metric for, you still have to talk to the person to
Oh my
really get
God.
beyond that point. Am I right in that belief?
Michael, 100%. And I mean, it scares me the number of academics in suicide research who never have those conversations directly. And then they're making assumptions, telling other people.
Assumptions everywhere.
Yeah, and it's so, so dangerous. I always say, like, suicide it's so complicated, Michael. So many factors come into somebody's suicidal pain. It's so individual. And the way that I describe it is that every suicidal person, it's their own symphony of sorrow. I have my own symphony of sorrow, Michael, that's different to your symphony or the symphony of other people listening, because I've had my own individual lived experiences in history. I've got my own biology, my own kind of different things happening in here. So as researchers, you can never say, I don't believe that in every symphony of sorrow, this is what the violin player in the fifth row, 3 seats to the left is playing. They're all playing those notes. I don't think you can say that. I think what you start to do is the more symphonies that you listen to, you start to go, oh, okay, it seems in the wind section, these are the kind of sounds that you will often hear. These are the kind of sounds in the brass section, which is when I talk about like those notes in the chord of pain, that's kind of, those are the sounds that I hear. Of course, it's then hugely individual in terms of the specifics of the things that have happened to you. And it's going to be hugely individual in terms of the things that are going to help you move forward with your life. But I think any intervention that helps strengthen your ability to regulate those 3 areas of your life can be beneficial to learning to manage your thoughts and feelings of suicide, which may never leave a person. They might be something that you carry with you, and it's about learning to cope with and manage those feelings when the crisis hits. And I think that's why, Michael, these community spaces, we've got things in the UK like Talk Club, men gather, and this is a really interesting thing, Michael, in terms of you talking about the language of men. So the Talk Club runs where they ask people, how are you out of 10? Because they found that like the men they were working with just didn't respond to a question like, how are you? Whereas asking them the specifics of how are you out of 10, okay, I can start to put a number on things, and then that opens up lots of other conversations based on that number that you can have.
We were speaking before about that, and I have seen some of that in the States, a little bit more of men having to or wanting to because they have to pick up the bearings, if you will, of taking care of their fellow man. I've been hearing a lot more about groups. And on the one hand, that has me pretty optimistic that there is something out there. On the other hand, I worry about groups that maybe are well-intentioned, but may engage in activities of masculinity or maleness that they attribute to being in a healthy frame that maybe aren't healthy for everybody or helpful for everybody. I think of the traditional, kind of examples of descriptions of groups, men's groups, where they'll just yell at each other, scream at each other. And on the one hand, there might be a place for that in someone's life. On the other hand, it's a little bit of a shotgun approach to say, I'm just going to throw this all at every man and it'll stick, it'll work. And it's like, no, you got to take that on a case by case basis.
Yeah.
So again, optimistic, but also a little cautious. Like, we have to particularize this. Particularize it. We'll see if I can keep that word to that individual man. And I think that's part of the conversation that is getting lost here is it's always been a challenge in this field to connect the macro level, the larger levels, let's say the pooled levels, to the individual experience. And I think a lot of what has happened over the last year is there's been such a push to recognize that individual experience that we've actually given too much precedence to the individual experience, that lived experience. However, if we're going to help somebody, if we're talking about as a clinician or as a researcher, really understanding them, I'm of the view is, we do prioritize the personal, the subjective, the intrapsychic, but we never over prioritize either side. We never say, okay, we know with this population in this research study of 1,000 people that these are for sure the members of the symphony, so to speak.
Yeah.
But we never take the individual suppositions for granted, because we're still helping them work through them understanding themselves, at least in my view, which, as a clinician, you could think you have the story, and then the next week life happens in between a session and a new insight emerges, and it can be an amazing thing. And that can vary from week to week. So it's a curious thing. Earlier, when we were talking about toxic masculinity, I was thinking back to some research that I did in the past of this idea, this linguistic idea of, I think it was persuasive conflation, that by taking two seemingly non-related terms together, you actually transmit the charge, positive or negative, of one term to the other. So in the case of toxic masculinity, the idea being that toxicity is something to be avoided. It's got a negative charge. Anything toxic, you are evolutionarily designed to want to stay away from. And combining that with masculinity may unfortunately make just the property of masculinity on its own seem inherently toxic, negative. And I can't imagine a world in which a paradigm like that exists, where we can have a conversation about masculinity as just its own property. I really don't see how we can have that conversation, and where that conversation is headed. We see a lot of young men, it seems, really, you talked about needing a good role model and that kind of representation for themselves, really looking to the internet, it seems, for sometimes helpful role models, but oftentimes not so helpful role models, particularly in the internet age. And I wonder if you have any thoughts as to where, if something like that were to continue, where we have this swath of individuals who are kind of leaning towards these unhelpful role models. For the record, women have unhealthy role models as well online, I believe. But I think for men, it has a particular tone and temperament, let's just say, that isn't particularly adaptive.
Yeah. And I think also there's a concern, Michael, about who are the young people that need the role models. Because if you've got good role models at home, I'm not saying that those kids don't also need role models, but there's an additional vulnerability if there's some kind of complexity at home of you craving guidance, support, being seen, being validated, on a deeper level. And so I think also there's some, I worry about the young boys that are gravitating to those things, because I worry about the things that have already happened to them that have made them kind of really ache for
To get that need met.
yeah, exactly. And I think I do it myself in my own life. I'm a massive football nut, soccer to you, but and a lot of the managers of the team that I support, or the captains, have been kind of like parasocial kind of guardians in a way. And fortunately, I mean, to some extent, you can't go too wrong with those people in terms of the behaviors that they encourage. But yeah, I think absolutely that there are, some people promoting a vision of masculinity that's heartbreaking, because what they're doing, Michael, is they're taking a group of people in the desert. Imagine meeting a group of people in the desert, and I see that you're dying of thirst. And I say to you, there's water in that direction. And I know that there's nothing but fucking sand. And that's the thing that I find so, so heartbreaking, is that there's groups of people in kind of, I think, desperate need of some sense of purpose, self-esteem, connection, being told that they're going to find it over there, and they're absolutely not. And I think that there has to be some responsibility taken by the rest of the adults in the room, that we're not stepping up and giving and helping those young people who are currently dying of thirst.
Well, you see that among, there's a reason we have ethical precepts related to research, in terms of who we can and can't offer, an incentive to do research to. Vulnerable populations that may be more inclined to do your research, if you were to offer them, there's an ethical consideration to make, because is that person in a state where they can actually consent to a process like that? It's almost the same kind of thing, at least as far as I can tell, as somebody in a vulnerable position finding themselves in a cult or an unhelpful group, that the extended hand to a suffering person can be great, but it depends whose hand it is and what their intentions are at the end of the day.
Yeah.
There is a point in development where people do, generally around, young adolescents, start to look more towards their peers and towards their social connections as a point of development, even if they do have a great support system at home. It's kind of a natural part of identity development to look for that supplemental space. But if in that supplemental space, it's riddled with minefields that you have to traverse in order to find what works for you, it seems it makes it very challenging, and also increases the possibility that somebody, even if they're not vulnerable, could run into that minefield inadvertently. There's no shortage of stories of people coming from prominent backgrounds, successful, affluent, loving, what have you, and still finding their way into a group that had more nefarious intentions. And I worry about that on a clinical front, but on a personal front as well for young men, how to help them best navigate that now. Because it seems like it could so easily just go the wrong way.
Oh, and there's a genie out of the bottle that we've no idea its psychological implications. For me, I think I don't know any adult such as myself who grew up without social media. I don't know any adult that grew up without it who thinks my childhood and adolescence would have been improved by having access to
It would have been
that.
better.
Yeah, we all know it's horrendous. I wouldn't have wanted a sniff of it. Oh my God. And yet, and I know it's so difficult, it's so complicated. And I think that in terms of our evolution, you said something interesting earlier about this sort of the focus on self. And, I think in terms of our evolutionary history, going back hundreds of millions and billions of years, like the level of selfhood that we now embody is relatively recent. It's this quite recent technology that I have that's really powerful, because I can think horrific thoughts about myself that are so painful to feel and can contribute then to that suicide. It's so painful that at times it can make people not want to be here anymore. That's how sort of dangerous this.
Very easy to upload a virus in some cases to the hardware. Absolutely.
Exactly. And then when you think, well, what is the language of toxic masculinity uploading? Like that to me feels like a cultural virus that's being uploaded to somebody's, hardware. So I have real kind of compassion for human beings trying to cope with this technology in our lives. And not of course, but I think we live, you're in America, I'm in Britain. These are real modern cults of selfhood compared to from what we can see from maybe past ways that not just that societies have organized themselves, but the things available to us now in terms of technologies and things like that.
Just the connectivity alone. I mean, there are those who want to do away with national boundaries, and I'm not advocating for that, not precisely in this moment, but we've become permeable to each other. I don't know if this is where you were heading, but like in terms of globalization, I can now talk to you. We're across a sea right now. I can now connect with somebody who, like yourself, is helpful and is compassionate and caring about what they're doing. And I can learn a lot from you and your expertise. I could also reach out to somebody where I am in a vulnerable position who is also maybe in a vulnerable position or wants to take advantage of that position. And that's not so helpful either. The genie really is out of the bottle as far as technology is concerned. I mean, connectivity versus connection, that's maybe the least of our concerns in terms of what's possible right now. There are a couple things I wanted to talk about. One was related to finances as it relates to men's mental health. I've talked to a number of individuals who are in the space, and that seems to always be a point of conversation. And it's not a bad heuristic to say follow the money. Whether it tells you something or not, we'll find out. But what is funding for research around men's issues, particularly male suicide, look like for you? And I know we touched on it. Man Up is an organization that does provide funding for you. I'd love to learn a little bit more about them, but also what the space looks like generally.
So Man Up are amazing. This beautiful guy called Dan set it up. I think he'd definitely be the number of funerals for men who died by suicide that he'd attended was definitely in double digits. And I think that there just came a point where he was like, I have to do something about it. And Dan talks quite openly about the fact he grew up in the care system in the UK and you know, he's had a challenging life, and so he comes to this work with this really beautiful purity of spirit and of way of seeing things. You know, when you talk about the language of men, like he's in this space just speaking the real purity of language, which I find really amazing. And yeah, so he's given me this. I'm in my second year of funding from them, and prior to that, I'd had support from two beautiful family trusts, so the Liam Britton Foundation and an organization called Jonathan's Boys, both set up by families that lost their sons, Liam and Jonathan, to suicide. And that helped fund some of my PhD work. But aside from that, I was kind of having to freelance work to support the research because, you know, funding is always challenging, Michael, and I'm very ambitious about us making real strides on this issue. Like, I would love to help sort of not motivate, but help facilitate other researchers that are really like passionately invested in this work to do the work that they want to do as well, because there's so many things so in the UK, men are at higher risk of suicide than women, and then it's almost double again when you look at men with disabilities. Like, the suicide rate there is something scary, and as far as I know, not a piece of research really looking at that. Michael, for me, these things it's not acceptable, you know. And so the questions that we were asking earlier about fathers, you know, we don't know. And we need to start knowing, because people are dying, men are dying, and then families are being devastated, families that will never recover. You know, I speak all the time to bereaved families. My heart absolutely breaks for them, for this sort of crushing pain that they've inherited and will carry, you know, their own backpacks now. So I really want to see some funding mobilization around. I'm biased, Michael. There's some terrible research out there, like all professions. Like, there's some terrible therapists, and there are terrible plumbers, and there are terrible chefs, and there's amazing therapists, that some of who have changed my life. But great when research is done well, and you get that robust evidence base from that evidence base that's engaged with people living the reality. So to really understand the problem through the lens of the people that live it, then we can start to build effective interventions, you know, and that's the kind of pipeline of magic that I want to start seeing some proper funding going into understanding these things, and funding to support, you know, people in your profession. I speak to a lot of therapists who want to be able to better support their male clients, but haven't been given training or support. We did a survey in the UK of health professionals. And so suicide is the biggest killer of men under 50 in this country. And 96% of the health professionals we surveyed have never had any training in it. So the biggest thing one of the biggest risks for men, the health professionals have not been supported in understanding it. And I feel so much for those people. I mean, it's kind of you know, I'm aware of, like, being a researcher or in the academic world. I'm not on that front line in the same way that you are, and your colleagues are, and the responsibility and pressure that can then come in terms of you know, the daily work that you deliver. So there's got to be more funding as well for training professionals. And, you know, I think that there's an army of people ready to be mobilized. We've just got to start mobilizing.
Do you
And
think
also,
do you think it's that they're siloed, Susie? I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, particularly after talking with George from the Tin Men, and I get this sense it's like the UK is trying to handle it on its own terms. The United States is trying to handle it on its own terms, which becomes a tapestry of states and confusion, to say the least. And then you have other countries trying to deal with on their terms. And yet there seem to be those of us who are crossing the divide and having this conversation in different countries and saying, I'm learning about the initiatives through you and through others, what's going on in the UK. I've been trying to learn about the initiatives that are taking place in the United States. But it almost seems like we need almost like a global initiative here, because this is a cross-cultural issue, it seems.
yeah.
that is going largely unaddressed. It's if there were any other group that we saw that we were aware of in the same way, I would assume that we would each well, I would hope that we would get to doing something about it. Yet half of the world's population is being ignored on this front, it feels. And I feel the passion and the compassion, but also the fatigue from those such as yourself who have been doing this work and trying to, it's very Sisyphusian, it feels, of pushing this boulder uphill. Although I do think it's making tracks. I do think it's gaining distance here, but it's almost like the conversation's siloed out. Each place is kind of, it's on its own in figuring the issue out.
Yeah. I agree with what you're saying. It's interesting as well. I do agree that there's progress being made. It's always difficult with this topic because I'm also aware every day there's people no longer here because we haven't made sufficient progress. So you always feel acutely aware of the urgency, which again, I think sometimes, it does make it difficult to be, calm about things. And I also have a real concern. It's virtually every country in the world that there are higher death rates for men by suicide. It's a global issue. And of course, there'll be cultural nuance to those three notes of pain.
Relationship with their own emotions, relationship with their thoughts, and then relationship with others.
Yeah. So the relationships with thoughts and feelings about self. So how you feel about yourself. And then I think it's 71% of all global suicides are in low income countries. So there's also
71%.
Yeah, a huge, majority of people that, and there's some brilliant, beautiful researchers in countries where resources are, I'm complaining about resources, but resources are really, really brutal and still huge cultural stigma around suicide. All of those, I want us to be able to support, those individuals that are in really difficult circumstances saying, I want to do something to understand this issue better. Like as a global community, we should be responding with the resources to kind of help them to do that. So there's multiple fronts in which I agree with what you're saying, that a sort of global entity on this would be
perhaps idyllic, but still maybe something to strive for. Particularly given its pernicious and at this point, in terms of awareness, long-standing nature. We haven't moved past the point of awareness to as much action, I think, as this massive group deserves. And somebody could say it's my bias for me being in that seat, but at the same time, no, it's the question of, are we going to put our money where our mouth is, so to speak? Are we actually going?
Yeah. I always say, Michael, like there are certain big killers of human beings. It's 2025 and there are certain big killers of human beings that we're at the limit of our scientific understanding on. So we just don't know how to prevent those deaths because it's beyond our understanding at the moment. And hopefully with time we'll get there. Suicide is different because it's part of the medicine for suicidal pain. It's in you and it's in me. It's the love, it's the compassion, it's the taking care of one another. It's, uh, uh, making space for the ways in which life can be fucking brutal at times, and being alongside each other, as compassionately as we can. And I think for me that there's some collective responsibility that we all need to bear about how are we being medicinal for one another. And I know that so many people are, the world turns on the medicinal love of so many people, teachers, nurses, paramedics, firefighters. There's so much medicinal love and compassion in this world. But I think that we have to start to understand that men are absolutely deserving recipients of that medicinal love and compassion as well.
I love that term, and I might borrow that with a callback to you, because medicinal love, I think, is exactly it. There can be a platonic sense there of just, how about a general sense of humanity that still resides in all of us. And before we wrap up, I want to ask you, if anybody's watching this if any man is watching this who may find themselves in that position, or for those who have men in their lives that they love and they connect with, what would you want those people to walk away with?
I guess I think so many men that I speak to, Michael, feel deeply alone with their pain. And I hope through this conversation and the fact that this conversation is two people that really, really care about that pain and want to find a way to stop you having to be so alone with it, in some way helps, even if it's just for the period of this conversation, helps you feel less alone and helps you feel encouraged in the sense that your pain is seen and your pain is a motivating fuel for me every day in my work to try and have different outcomes for men. And then I think for the people that are worried about men, it's been so important for me to do the self-reflective work about the biases and the assumptions that I was making about men and the male experience. And doing that work, I kind of describe it as putting my brain through a car wash.
Going for a quick scrub.
Yeah, but the scrub's been like really intensive, getting into, but has helped me enormously, I think, to be a better like friend, sister, colleague, collaborator. I hope so. And I think that that is hopefully allows me to give more medicinal love to the men in my life. But I also say that, Michael, you know, I've been alongside people in suicidal crises. I know that it is all consuming at times, and the worry and anxiety and stress of it runs deep, 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 deep. I, you know, send a tremendous amount of love and compassion to everybody struggling with those things. And also, Michael, for me, it's a really normal part of life. I said to you earlier, like, I'm somebody that myself has had thoughts of suicide, like the first one probably when I was around 17, 18, and the last one probably 2 weeks ago. Like, for me, it's a really normal part of my life and how I function. But at the same time, as well as kind of normalizing those thoughts and feelings, there is a need to take them very seriously. And, you know, I, for myself, have to learn to strengthen my skills in terms of what do I need to do when those thoughts arrive, in terms of managing them so that they're not pushing me in a direction of travel that ultimately I don't want to go.
You know, it's one of those things that perhaps it's a conversation for another time where sometimes our minds generate things without our consent. I'd argue quite often they generate things without our consent, but they're not without value or without interpretive
Yeah.
weight. And I've often operated from the school of thought, and I think I do most of the time, that thoughts like suicide, intrusive or otherwise, meaning, you know, whether you're consciously engaging with them or they're just generating in the backdrop, are often an indication for an individual. And I wonder what you think about this, that some stressor, something in the environment, something that they're going through, or maybe even their entire life script needs to be renegotiated. And that it's calling to that individual. It's almost like a
Mhm.
natural response to circumstances that have become untenable in some cases, and that we can actually use that just like we would any emotion or any experience
Yeah.
to further explore what's going on for us. And perhaps that's more of a conversation that we should be having around the topic.
Absolutely, Michael. I think it's a beautiful way of putting it. I often think of it, it's like a spiritual death that I'm attending. It's like a funeral of some aspects of myself that is still in pain, still suffering, that needs to be let go of. And this is what I mean about learning the tools to manage that period, because often when you come out of it, you can start to see, even if it's tiny, like a glimmer of, I mean, I'm saying this, there can be, I was going to say some sort of like glimmer of understanding, but I'm saying that as someone in a therapeutic process.
Mm.
And I think that, you know, that's not always necessarily going to be the case for, there's some lesson I have found. There are deep, deep lessons I have found in my pain. It's some part of my psyche trying to tell me things that I need to deal with and figure out. And those lessons come often slowly. And there may be long periods of years and years in between the lessons. And so I wouldn't want anyone to sort of take from this that it's a like linear process. For me, like managing your pain, it's a lifelong thing. You and I are going to be doing that in our own unique ways till the
It's a part of
day
the
we
ride.
die.
It's a part of the ride.
Yeah, exactly. Part of the human experience.
Well, Susie, let me ask you, how can people find you? How can they support you? Where are the best places to look?
The best place to find me is probably on Instagram, which is at male_suicide_research. So I try to post findings and events and things like our conversation now on there. Anyone that wants to find me with several $1 million of money for research and funding, then
We'll send them your way.
they're particularly welcome.
Wonderful. And just thank you so much for coming on and joining
Pleasure,
me, joining
Michael.
us, having such a real vulnerable and candid conversation about a topic that many find really challenging. And I think that a lot of people who will hear this can benefit from your wisdom and your insights. The men both in your life and the men that you work with and the men that you share the stories of are lucky to have you. Your compassion absolutely rings through. It was obvious to me the first time we met. It was obvious in the first video I ever saw you on. It's obvious to me now. And I just want to thank you for what you're doing.
Bless your heart, Michael. And thank you so much. And thank you to the people listening who I know often are engaged in work like you do. Like, it's difficult sometimes not to look at the world and despair, but that's what I mean about the medicinal love that is keeping the world turning. Like you and colleagues who've decided, with my one life, I want to try and support people in pain to be in less pain. And lots of different people are all doing that in their own different ways. And that's the thing that makes me think being a human being isn't so bad after all. So thank you also to you and people listening.
Thank you. And let's keep the conversation going.
Absolutely.
All right, Susie. Thank you so much.
Cheers.